In the late 1940s and early 1950s, before African liberation struggles hardened into large-scale proxy wars, and long before conflicts in Angola, Mozambique, or the Congo became synonymous with Cold War violence, the continent emerged as a quieter but strategically significant arena of competition between the CIA and the KGB. Because decolonization introduced political uncertainty across vast territories whose future alignments were undecided, and both superpowers understood that early influence over emerging movements could shape outcomes without the costs and visibility of later militarization. This early phase was defined less by arms shipments and battlefield advisors than by intelligence assessment, political cultivation, and covert positioning, as Washington and Moscow sought to determine which nationalist leaders, parties, and labor organizations might be receptive to their respective models of development and governance, and which posed risks of alignment with the opposing bloc. For the CIA, Africa initially presented an intelligence challenge characterized by limited access, sparse reporting, and reliance on colonial intermediaries, because U.S. diplomatic and intelligence presence on the continent was thin and often filtered through British and French perspectives that emphasize stability and gradual reform rather than revolutionary change, while for the KGB, the challenge was different, rooted in Moscow's ideological commitment to anti-imperialism, coupled with limited operational infrastructure in regions long dominated by Western powers. As a result, the earliest competition unfolded through information gathering and political reconnaissance, with both services attempting to map nationalist landscapes, identify credible leaders, and assess whether liberation movements were genuinely autonomous or susceptible to communist influence. In this period, intelligence reporting treated Africa not as a unified theater, but as a mosaic of local struggles, shaped by colonial policy, ethnic composition, and economic structure, and both the CIA and the KGB devoted analytical resources to distinguishing pragmatic nationalism from ideological radicalism, a distinction that mattered because it determined whether engagement would take the form of discreet support, cautious observation, or active countermeasures. Early CIA assessments tended to emphasize the risk that Soviet influence could exploit anti-colonial sentiment by positioning itself as the champion of liberation, particularly in territories where colonial repression was most visible, while simultaneously warning that overt U.S. alignment with European powers could alienate emerging elites and cede morale ground to Moscow. Soviet intelligence, for its part, evaluated liberation movements through the lens of class struggle and anti-imperialist ideology, but operational reporting often revealed skepticism about the organizational coherence and ideological discipline of many African groups, leading Moscow to adopt a selective approach that prioritized long-term influence over immediate revolutionary action. This mutual caution shaped a competitive environment in which intelligence services focused on building contacts, gathering biographical data on leaders, and monitoring student movements, trade unions, and exile networks, recognizing that these channels often produced the first generation of post-colonial elites. During the early 1950s, universities, international conferences, and labor organizations became key nodes of intelligence interest because they provided relatively accessible venues where African activists interacted with foreign sponsors, journalists, and diplomats, and both the CIA and the KGB sought to observe and, where possible, influence these interactions without triggering counterintelligence backlash. For the CIA, this meant expanding reporting from cultural and educational exchanges, quietly funding research and outreach programs that framed American development assistance as an alternative to revolutionary socialism, and cultivating moderate nationalist figures who emphasized constitutional paths to independence, while avoiding actions that could be interpreted as direct interference in colonial administration. The KGB, constrained by limited presence on the ground, relied more heavily on international communist networks, front organizations, and sympathetic intermediaries to establish contact with African activists, assessing which movements could be gradually oriented towards socialist alignment once independence was achieved. Throughout this phase, both services operated under uncertainty because liberation movements were fluid, leadership was often contested, and ideological positions were still forming, making early intelligence judgments provisional and subject to revision as local conditions evolved. The competition was further complicated by the fact that African leaders themselves were acutely aware of superpower interest and often leveraged it to enhance their own standing, extracting rhetorical or material support while resisting formal alignment, a dynamic that intelligence reporting captured as both opportunity and risk. By the mid-1950s, as decolonization accelerated and the number of independent African states increased, the CIA and the KGB had accumulated substantial dossiers on emerging movements and leaders, yet neither side possessed decisive leverage, reflecting the reality that the early phase of competition was about positioning rather than control. This period established patterns that would later harden into proxy conflict. But at this stage, the struggle remained largely political and informational, defined by cautious engagement, competing narratives of development and liberation, and an ongoing effort by both intelligence services to anticipate which movements would shape Africa's post-colonial future and how early influence might translate into strategic alignment once independence became irreversible. As the early competition unfolded, both the CIA and the KGB confronted the reality that African liberation movements operated within political environments fundamentally different from those of Europe or Asia, because colonial administrations had suppressed formal party structures, leaving nationalist activity fragmented across unions, churches, ethnic associations, and informal networks whose loyalties were fluid and whose leadership hierarchies were often unstable, and this complexity forced intelligence services to prioritize socio-political mapping over immediate operational action. CIA reporting from the early 1950s emphasized that many liberation movements were less ideologically coherent than externally portrayed, driven more by grievances over land, labor conditions, and political exclusion than by doctrinal commitments. And analysts cautioned against assuming that anti-colonial rhetoric equated to pro-Soviet alignment, a warning that shaped a cautious approach centered on differentiation rather than blanket opposition. The KGB reached similar conclusions through its own channels, noting in internal assessments that the absence of disciplined party organization limited the immediate revolutionary potential of many movements, and that premature militarization risked alienating local support, leading Moscow to favor political education, international exposure, and long-term cadre development over direct confrontation. This convergence of caution did not reduce competition, but it defined its character as both services sought to position themselves as credible partners to emerging elites without forcing premature commitments that could backfire once independence was achieved. Intelligence collection therefore focused heavily on biographical analysis, with detailed files compiled on activists' educational backgrounds, overseas contacts, ethnic affiliations, and personal ambitions, because such factors were considered more predictive of future alignment than abstract ideological statements. Student movements in metropolitan centers such as London, Paris, and Moscow became particularly important intelligence targets, as they brought together future African leaders in environments where surveillance and contact were easier to manage. And both the CIA and the KGB devoted resources to monitoring conferences, seminars, and cultural exchanges, where political ideas circulated and networks formed. The CIA, operating within Western capitals, leveraged access to academic institutions, foundations, and labor organizations to observe and sometimes support moderate nationalist figures, framing American engagement in terms of development assistance, technical expertise, and gradual self-government, while remaining careful to avoid overt association with colonial repression that could discredit its contacts. The KGB, drawing on international communist organizations and front groups, sought to introduce African activists to socialist models of modernization and to cultivate relationships that could be activated later, recognizing that immediate ideological conversion was unlikely, but that long-term exposure could shape perceptions once power was within reach. Intelligence reporting from this phase highlighted the strategic importance of narrative competition, as both sides attempted to influence how liberation was conceptualized, whether as a process of national self-determination compatible with multiple development paths, or as a revolutionary struggle inseparable from anti-capitalist transformation. And this narrative contest unfolded through publications, conferences, and informal discussion rather than through direct propaganda campaigns. The role of colonial intelligence services added another layer of complexity, as British and French security agencies monitored nationalist movements closely and sometimes shared reporting with American counterparts, shaping CIA assessments while simultaneously constraining independent U.S. engagement, whereas Soviet intelligence operated largely outside colonial security structures and therefore relied more heavily on open-source analysis and international contacts. This asymmetry influenced early outcomes, with the CIA often possessing more granular information about internal dynamics in specific territories, but facing political constraints on action, while the KGB enjoyed ideological credibility among some activists, but struggled to translate it into operational presence. Throughout this period, both services grappled with the problem of timing, recognizing that overt support for liberation movements before independence risked provoking colonial backlash and international controversy. Yet delaying engagement could allow rivals to establish early relationships that would prove decisive later, and intelligence assessments reflected ongoing debate over how to balance these risks. By the mid-1950s, as the pace of decolonization accelerated and international attention increasingly focused on Africa, the early phase of CIA-KGB competition had produced a landscape of tentative contacts, competing assessments, and unresolved alignments, setting the stage for more intense rivalry once independence created new states whose security forces, economic policies, and diplomatic orientations would become central to Cold War strategy. At this stage, however, the struggle remained largely anticipatory, defined by observation, selective cultivation, and narrative positioning rather than by the militarized interventions that would later dominate perceptions of superpower involvement in Africa, underscoring that the foundations of later proxy conflicts were laid not in battles, but in the quieter intelligence work of understanding, influencing, and waiting for political outcomes that had not yet crystallized. By the mid-1950s, as the international legitimacy of decolonization gained momentum, and African issues moved from the margins of global politics into the center of diplomatic debate, the CIA and the KGB increasingly treated liberation movements as future governing authorities rather than temporary revolutionary actors, a shift that altered intelligence priorities because the question was no longer simply who opposed colonial rule, but who could plausibly administer a state, maintain order, and align diplomatically once independence was achieved. And this forward-looking assessment placed new emphasis on leadership capacity, organizational discipline, and external orientation. CIA intelligence estimates from this period increasingly categorized movements according to their potential trajectories, distinguishing between those likely to evolve into pragmatic nationalist governments open to Western engagement and those whose internal structures and rhetoric suggested susceptibility to socialist alignment. And these estimates informed early policy debates about whether the United States should engage directly with liberation leaders or continue to rely on European allies to manage transitions. The KGB, operating within an ideological framework that emphasized anti-imperialist solidarity, nevertheless applied its own filters, evaluating whether movements possessed sufficient cohesion and popular support to survive the post-independence transition without fragmenting. And Moscow's intelligence reporting often warned that premature endorsement of weak or factionalized groups could produce unreliable partners whose failure would damage Soviet credibility. This mutual emphasis on viability reflected an emerging consensus within both intelligence services that influence acquired before independence would only matter if it translated into durable relationships afterward. And this realization reinforced a cautious approach that favored political education, international exposure, and selective material support over rapid militarization. Intelligence reporting from this phase also highlighted the growing importance of international forums, particularly the United Nations and Pan-African conferences, as arenas where liberation movements sought recognition and legitimacy, and both the CIA and the KGB monitored these venues closely, understanding that diplomatic visibility could elevate certain leaders above rivals and shape external perceptions of who represented legitimate national aspirations. For the CIA, these forums offered opportunities to observe how African leaders articulated their goals to different audiences, and whether they emphasized non-alignment, Western partnership, or socialist solidarity, while for the KGB, they provided access points to cultivate relationships under the banner of international cooperation, often through intermediaries from established communist parties or sympathetic states. The role of non-aligned rhetoric became a focal point of intelligence analysis, as both services recognized that many African leaders adopted language of independence from both blocs not as a rejection of engagement, but as a negotiating position designed to maximize autonomy and external support. And intelligence assessments treated this rhetoric as a variable rather than a fixed alignment indicator. Within this environment, economic development emerged as a key battleground of influence because liberation movements increasingly framed their legitimacy around promises of modernization, social justice, and national integration, and intelligence services evaluated how competing development models resonated with African leaders' priorities and constraints, shaping early outreach efforts that emphasized technical assistance, education, and infrastructure over ideological messaging. The CIA sought to present American involvement as compatible with national sovereignty and gradual reform, while the KGB emphasized the Soviet experience of rapid industrialization and anti-colonial solidarity, yet both services encountered skepticism from African leaders who viewed external models as resources to be adapted rather than templates to be adopted wholesale. Intelligence reporting captured this dynamic as both opportunity and risk, noting that leaders who skillfully balanced external influences could maintain autonomy, but might also shift alignment opportunistically, complicating long-term strategic planning. By the late 1950s, as independence became imminent in multiple territories, the early phase of CIA-KGB competition had generated extensive intelligence archives but limited decisive influence, reflecting the reality that liberation movements remained primarily driven by local conditions and internal politics rather than by superpower direction. This outcome underscored a central lesson of the early African competition, that intelligence access and ideological sympathy did not automatically translate into control, and that the superpower's ability to shape outcomes would depend increasingly on post-independence engagement rather than pre-independence positioning, a realization that would fundamentally alter the nature of CIA and KGB involvement in Africa as the continent moved from liberation to governance, and as Cold War rivalry intensified in the decades that followed. As independence approached in several African territories toward the end of the 1950s, the CIA and the KGB confronted a narrowing window in which early political cultivation could still influence post-colonial trajectories, and intelligence reporting from this period reflects an increasing urgency tempered by recognition of structural limits, because liberation movements were transitioning from oppositional networks into proto-governments whose internal priorities were shaped by domestic legitimacy rather than external alignment. CIA assessments emphasized that once independence was achieved, leaders would face immediate pressures to consolidate authority, manage ethnic and regional divisions, and deliver economic results. Pressures that could override ideological affinities cultivated during the liberation phase. And this expectation reinforced a strategic focus on identifying which movements possessed administrative competence and which were likely to fragment under the strain of governance. The KGB reached parallel conclusions, noting that the credibility of socialist alignment depended on the ability of post-colonial governments to demonstrate tangible improvements in living conditions, and intelligence reporting cautioned that overt ideological pressure could provoke nationalist backlash, leading Moscow to emphasize patience and adaptability in its engagement. This convergence in analytical outlook did not diminish rivalry, but reshaped it, as both services increasingly viewed Africa as a long-term contest in which early influence would have to be reinforced through sustained economic, military, and political support after independence, rather than secured definitively during the liberation struggle itself. Intelligence collection during this period therefore focused on transition planning within movements, including the formation of interim governments, security arrangements, and party structures, because these elements would determine who controlled the levers of power once colonial administrations withdrew. CIA reporting paid particular attention to the role of security forces, assessing whether liberation movements were developing disciplined internal security capabilities or relying on ad hoc arrangements that could be penetrated or co-opted by rivals, while the KGB evaluated the extent to which emerging leaders were willing to adopt centralized party control as a means of maintaining cohesion. International exposure continued to shape intelligence priorities as African leaders traveled extensively to seek support and recognition, and both services monitored these engagements closely to assess how rhetoric shifted across audiences and whether commitments made abroad translated into concrete organizational changes at home. Intelligence reports from late 1950s conferences captured the increasing sophistication of African leaders in navigating superpower competition, noting that many deliberately avoided binding commitments while extracting resources, training, and political support from multiple sources, a strategy that complicated efforts by both the CIA and the KGB to establish exclusive influence. This dynamic reinforced a broader reassessment within intelligence communities that African liberation movements could not be treated as passive recipients of external direction, but as strategic actors capable of leveraging Cold War rivalry to advance their own agendas, an insight that would later inform more assertive post-independence policies. As the early phase drew to a close, Intelligence evaluations increasingly framed the period not as a missed opportunity, but as a formative stage in which patterns of interaction, perception, and expectation were established, shaping how post-colonial governments would engage with superpowers once sovereignty was achieved. By the dawn of the 1960s, the CIA and the KGB had accumulated extensive knowledge of African political landscapes and leadership networks, yet neither had secured decisive control, reflecting the fundamental reality that liberation was driven primarily by local forces and that external influence, while consequential, operated within constraints imposed by nationalism and the imperatives of state building. This realization marked the transition from an early phase defined by reconnaissance and cultivation to a more intense period of competition characterized by material support, security cooperation, and eventually proxy conflict, underscoring that the foundations of later Cold War struggles in Africa were laid during this quieter era of intelligence rivalry, when outcomes were still fluid, but control remained elusive. As the 1960s approached and the number of independent African states expanded rapidly, intelligence assessments within both the CIA and the KGB increasingly treated the early phase of competition as a diagnostic period that revealed enduring structural realities about power, influence, and limitation in post-colonial environments. Because the accumulated evidence from the late 1940s and 1950s demonstrated that liberation movements were shaped far more by local political economies, social hierarchies, and nationalist imperatives than by external ideological sponsorship. And this understanding forced a recalibration of expectations, even as rivalry intensified. CIA analytical reviews conducted at the turn of the decade emphasized that early engagement had produced uneven results, with some movements maintaining cordial relations with the West, while others gravitated towards socialist alignment. Yet in most cases, these outcomes reflected internal dynamics rather than intelligence manipulation, leading analysts to conclude that the E2B primary value of early competition lay in situational awareness and relationship building, rather than decisive control. The KGB reached analogous conclusions, noting that while anti-imperialist rhetoric created openings for Soviet engagement, the absence of disciplined party structures and the prevalence of ethnic and regional divisions limited the reliability of liberation movements as long-term partners, and intelligence reporting cautioned that influence secured through ideological solidarity could dissipate rapidly once leaders confronted the practical demands of governance. This shared recognition underscored a central lesson of the early African phase, that intelligence services could shape perceptions and provide resources, but could not substitute for domestic legitimacy, an insight that would inform more interventionist strategies in later years when superpowers sought to compensate for this limitation through military and economic leverage. During this transitional moment, intelligence focus shifted toward continuity and risk management, as both services evaluated which post-independence governments were likely to remain stable, which were vulnerable to internal challenge, and which might seek external backing to consolidate power. Assessments that would guide subsequent policy decisions and covert actions. The early phase also highlighted the importance of regional spillover, as intelligence reporting noted that developments in one territory influenced neighboring movements through shared ethnic ties, migration, and ideological exchange, creating diffusion effects that could amplify alignment trends beyond national borders, and both the CIA and the KGB incorporated these regional dynamics into their planning. Despite these insights, intelligence communities recognized that the early competition had not produced a decisive advantage for either bloc, because African leaders consistently resisted exclusive alignment and exploited superpower rivalry to preserve autonomy a pattern that intelligence reporting described as pragmatic non-alignment rather than ideological neutrality. This outcome reinforced the view that Africa represented a theater of prolonged competition rather than rapid resolution, and that early intelligence work had laid the groundwork for engagement, but not determined final outcomes. By the end of this phase, intelligence archives contained extensive biographical data, network maps, and political assessments that would inform future operations. Yet the absence of clear victories underscored the limits of intelligence power in shaping liberation struggles driven by deeply rooted historical forces. As the Cold War moved into a more confrontational stage in Africa during the 1960s and 1970s, the early phase receded into the background, overshadowed by proxy wars and overt interventions. But within intelligence institutions, it remained a reference point, cited as evidence that influence acquired through early contact and narrative positioning was contingent and reversible. In retrospect, this period demonstrated that the competition over African liberation movements before escalation was less about winning allegiance than about understanding the terrain, establishing presence, and preparing for a future in which independence would transform political movements into states, and that the intelligence services of both superpowers entered that future with knowledge, relationships, and expectations shaped by a decade of cautious rivalry, whose consequences would only fully unfold in the years that followed. As the early phase of CIA and KGB competition over African liberation movements concluded, and the continent entered a new era of sovereignty, intelligence assessments increasingly framed the preceding decade as a formative but inherently constrained period. Because while both services had devoted substantial resources to observation, cultivation, and narrative positioning, the outcomes underscored that liberation politics were driven primarily by indigenous forces whose priorities could not be reliably subordinated to external strategy. And this realization shaped how intelligence planners interpreted the limits of early engagement. Internal reviews emphasized that African leaders who emerged from liberation movements were not ideological proxies, but political actors navigating fragmented societies, weak institutions, and intense expectations. And intelligence reporting consistently noted that alignment decisions were often tactical responses to immediate challenges rather than expressions of long-term commitment, complicating efforts by both the CIA and the KGB to translate early contacts into durable influence. The early phase also revealed the importance of timing, as intelligence services learned that premature pressure could harden resistance, while delayed engagement could allow rivals to establish relationships that were difficult to displace, creating a narrow margin in which influence could be exerted without provoking backlash, a margin that proved difficult to exploit consistently across diverse contexts. This tension was evident in assessments of movements that embraced non-alignment as a strategic doctrine, using it to secure aid and recognition from multiple sources while retaining autonomy, a pattern intelligence analysts described as a rational response to structural vulnerability rather than ideological ambivalence, and one that limited the effectiveness of binary Cold War frameworks. Intelligence reporting from this period also highlighted the uneven impact of international exposure, noting that while some leaders who engaged extensively with foreign sponsors adopted organizational models or policy preferences aligned with those experiences, others treated external engagement as transactional, compartmentalizing it from domestic decision-making in ways that preserved independence. For both the CIA and the KGB, these findings reinforced the conclusion that early competition had been valuable primarily for intelligence collection and situational awareness, providing insights into leadership psychology, factional dynamics, and regional trends that would inform later interventions, rather than for securing immediate strategic alignment. This perspective shaped subsequent policy debates, as intelligence assessments cautioned against overestimating the leverage derived from early cultivation and emphasized the need for sustained post-independence engagement to maintain influence, a lesson that would drive the escalation of involvement in later decades. The early phase also illuminated the role of African agency in Cold War competition, as intelligence services acknowledged that liberation movements and emerging states actively shaped the terms of engagement, extracting resources and recognition while resisting control, an acknowledgement that challenged simplistic narratives of superpower manipulation. By the early 1960s, as proxy conflicts loomed and superpower involvement deepened, the quieter intelligence work of the previous decade was overshadowed. Yet within intelligence institutions, it remained a reference point for understanding why later efforts would require more direct forms of leverage to overcome the limitations revealed by early competition. In this sense, the early CIA-KGB rivalry over African liberation movements functioned as a prelude rather than a decisive chapter, establishing patterns of interaction, expectation, and miscalculation that would define subsequent Cold War struggles on the continent, and demonstrating that influence acquired through intelligence engagement before independence was provisional, contingent, and subject to rapid erosion once political realities shifted, a conclusion that underscored the enduring challenge of translating early access into lasting strategic advantage in a decolonizing world. In the final assessment of the early CIA and KGB competition over African liberation movements, the period before escalation stood as a revealing illustration of the limits and possibilities of intelligence influence in a decolonizing environment, because it demonstrated that while early engagement could shape awareness, access, and perception, it could not predetermine outcomes driven by nationalist imperatives and domestic political realities that lay beyond external control. And intelligence evaluations from the early 1960s increasingly framed this phase as a necessary but insufficient foundation for later involvement. Both intelligence services concluded that the decisive factor in post-colonial alignment would not be ideological affinity cultivated during the liberation struggle, but the capacity of new governments to maintain internal stability and deliver tangible benefits under severe economic and social constraints, a realization that recast earlier intelligence efforts as preparatory rather than determinative. Within CIA and KGB institutional memory, the early African phase was cited as evidence that intelligence access did not equate to authority, and that the absence of formal state structures during liberation limited the ability of external actors to translate relationships into enforceable commitments once sovereignty was achieved. This understanding informed a more interventionist posture in subsequent years, as both superpowers sought to compensate for the shortcomings revealed by early competition through deeper economic involvement, security assistance, and, eventually, direct proxy engagement, strategies that reflected a belief that influence had to be anchored in state power, rather than movement-level relationships. At the same time, intelligence reporting acknowledged that the early phase had shaped African leaders' perceptions of the superpowers, teaching them to navigate rivalry with sophistication and to resist exclusive alignment, a legacy that would complicate later efforts at control and contribute to the persistence of non-alignment as a strategic posture across much of the continent. The early competition also underscored the adaptability of African political actors, whose ability to leverage external interest without surrendering autonomy challenged assumptions embedded in Cold War planning and forced intelligence services to revise analytical frameworks that had underestimated local agency. By the time escalation occurred in specific theaters, the groundwork laid during this period influenced how both sides interpreted events, assessed risks, and justified involvement. Yet, It also served as a reminder that early intelligence engagement, however extensive, could not substitute for the structural determinants of power that emerged only after independence. In retrospect, the CIA-KGB rivalry over African liberation movements before escalation was less a contest for immediate allegiance than a process of mutual learning in which both services confronted the constraints of operating in societies undergoing profound transformation. And this learning shaped the more overt and often more destructive forms of competition that followed. The early phase thus occupies a distinct place in Cold War history, not as a decisive struggle that determined Africa's alignment, but as the stage on which the superpowers discovered that influence in the post-colonial world would be contested, negotiated, and frequently resisted, a discovery that would reverberate through subsequent decades of intervention, proxy warfare, and strategic recalibration as Africa moved from liberation into the full glare of Cold War rivalry.